This video will focus on rounding decimals. Please make sure that you have this note sheet, this sheet, and this sheet all glued into your notes before starting. Okay, so if we look at the top of this sheet, it kind of walks you through the process that we're going to do. So we're going to look at the number 3 and 47 hundredths, and we want to round it to the nearest tenth. That means we want to see, is this number closer to 3 and 4 tenths, or is it closer to 3 and 5 tenths? Okay. We know that it will either round to 3 and 4 tenths, or 3 and 5 tenths, or 3 and 40 hundredths, 3 and 50 hundredths. These numbers are the first and last numbers on the number line. So when we look at what numbers it's going to round to, those should be your two outside benchmarks. And we know that 3 and 45 hundredths is halfway between 3 and 40 hundredths and 3 and 50 hundredths. So we're going to put that one in the center. Finally, you're going to place the decimals that you are rounding on the number line, and then you're going to determine, is it closer to 3 and 40 hundredths, or is it closer to 3 and 50 hundredths? And since when we look at this, if I were to add these in, 1, 2, 3, 4, you can see that it's actually only 3 jumps away, or 3 hundredths away, because it would be 48 hundredths, 49 hundredths, 50 hundredths. So you can see 3 jumps, or it's 7 jumps back. So it's going to round to 3 and 5 tenths, or 3 and 50 hundredths, because that's where it is closer. Okay. Let's look at the one on the bottom. We're actually going to do this one together. So nothing is labeled. You will have to do that with me. So we're looking at 4 and 54 hundredths, and we want to round it to the nearest tenths place. That means we need to determine, is it going to be closer to 4 and 5 tenths? So your smaller benchmark is always going to be what's written, or what's currently in that tenths place. So this one we want to know, is it closer to 4 and 5 tenths, or is it closer to 4 and 6 tenths? So again, that's the same as 4 and 50 hundredths, or 4 and 60 hundredths. And we're going to go halfway between, and halfway between 50 and 60 is 55. So we have 51, 52, 53, 50. So this right here is our halfway point, and it is 4 and 55 hundredths. We want to go ahead and place 4 and 54 hundredths on the number line. So again, that's going to go right here. And any time that we're rounding decimals, we use our halfway point to determine, is it closer to the right benchmark, or is it closer to the left benchmark? And in this case, 4 and 54 hundredths is 4 jumps away. That's 1, 2, 3, 4 jumps away, and those are all hundredths. So it's 4 hundredths away from 4 and 50 hundredths, where it would be 6 jumps away, or 6 hundredths away from the 4 and 6 tenths. So 4 and 54 hundredths is going to round down to 4 and 5 tenths. We can also use the halfway point and say, well, it hasn't quite made it halfway, so we know it's going to stay to the left. Anytime your number lands on the halfway point or to the right of it, you're going to round to your benchmark on the right. If it falls less than halfway, it's always going to round to the number, to your benchmark that is all the way to the left, okay? Down here, when it explains how you know, I already did that in words, but let's go ahead and write that in. And we can say 4 and 54 hundredths rounds to 4 and 5 tenths, because it is only 4 hundredths. Those are those jumps. Each jump is a hundredth in this particular problem. 4 hundredths away from, and I'm going to put 4 jumps in parentheses, and it is 6 hundredths, or 6 jumps away from 4 6/10. Okay, so it is closer to 4 5/10 than it is 4 6/10. All right. We have a few practice problems that we can do on number lines. You should already have the benchmarks in place, or I'm sorry, the tick marks in place, and we need to add in the benchmarks. So when we look at 47 hundredths, and we want to round it to the nearest tenth. So this is the place we want to round to, is the tenth place. Remember that our lowest benchmark is always going to be that number in that place value. So in this case, we're looking at 0 4/10. And this one would always be the next number up. So this one is going to be 0 5/10. Halfway between 4/10 and 5/10, which remember is the same as 40 hundredths and 50 hundredths, is going to be 45. So this is my halfway point. Oops, I don't want to make that there, but so this is 45 hundredths. And I actually want to mark 47 hundredths. So there's 46, here's 47 hundredths here. And when we look at this, we can see right away that 47 hundredths is beyond the halfway point. It is more than halfway. So it is only 3 hundredths away from 5/10 or 50 hundredths, but it is 7 jumps away from 4/10 or 40 hundredths. So below in this space here, we can write 47 hundredths rounds to 5/10. And again, it rounds to 5/10 because it's only 1, 2, 3 jumps or 3 hundredths away from 5/10, and it's 7 hundredths away from 4/10 or 40 hundredths. Look at this next one. It's a little bit different because it goes into the thousandths place. And this time we want to round to the nearest whole number. So I'm going to focus on the place I want to round to. So I want to look at my whole number. That has to be the number that we put all the way to our left benchmark. And so that's going to be 0. And our right benchmark is always going to be the next number up. So this case is going to be a 1. We are going to find our halfway point, and we're going to use tenths, so we'll kind of focus on this place value. So this place here is going to be 5/10. When I look at this number, 684 thousandths, I know it's going to fall between 6/10 and 7/10. So, and it's going to fall about right here. So when we talk about explaining why this number rounds to one whole, we can't necessarily say it's this many full jumps away. So we can just say 684 thousandths is beyond the halfway point, and therefore it rounds to 1. Or it is closer to one whole than it is to 0, and write that in that way. You could do the subtraction and figure all that out, but we're not going to. We're just going to say it's beyond the halfway point, so it is closer to one whole. All right, let's look at this last one. So for this one, we're going to look at rounding 1 52 thousandths to the nearest hundredth. So again, I'm rounding to the nearest hundredth, so I'm going to look at my hundredths place. That's what has to be on this benchmark, and it's everything before it too. So it's going to be 15 hundredths, or is it closer to 16 hundredths? The halfway point is going to be, put my 0 on so you can just see. I have 1 50, 1 60, so I know my halfway point is going to be 1 55 hundredths. And then I can mark 0 and 152 thousandths. So 1, 2, So this is 152 thousandths. And again, we can easily see it is, this case, it's 2 thousandths away. So that each jump is a thousandth. So it's 2 thousandths away from 1500ths, where it's 8 thousandths away from 160 thousandths or 1600ths. So 152 thousandths rounds to 1500ths because it, you can say, is less than halfway. You can say because it is closer to 1500ths, or you can say it is only 2 thousandths away from 1500ths and 8 thousandths away from 1600ths. So that's using the number line to round, but sometimes we don't want to use the number line and we actually just want to look at the number itself. Okay. Now in this particular case, you can see that when we're rounding to the nearest tenth, they have you circle the tenths place, underline the hundredths. I don't care what method you use to remember that. So when we're rounding 27 and 589 thousandths, we are going to look at, we want to round to the tenths place. So I tend to, underline. I might not always do the same thing for you. And I'm going to look here at my hundredths place. So I want to round here, and I'm going to look at my 8. When we look at the number 8, it's always bigger than 5. So if I can envision it on the number line, I know that it's going to be greater than 5, or that halfway point. So I know that it's going to round up, or it's going to be closer to making this number a 6. So this is going to round to 27 and 6 tenths. When we're rounding, think about our halfway point as 5. 6, 7, 8, and 9 are going to be to the right of the halfway point, rounding it up. And 4, 3, 2, 1 are to the left, meaning it's going to be smaller than a halfway point, making you round to that benchmark. So if we look at 3 and 648 thousandths, and I want to round it to the hundredths place, and that's the 4. And so I look at the 8. Again, the 8 is to the right of the halfway point, so we would end up rounding this to a 5 because my benchmarks would have been 3 and 64 hundredths and 3 and 65 hundredths. Okay, 48 is going to be closer, so we would round it. And then the last one on this, so up here, this would be 3 and 65 hundredths. For the bottom one, we have 5 and 872 thousandths, and we want to round it to the nearest whole number. So that's this place, and once again, the 8 is above, so we would round to 6 wholes. If we were looking at 4 and 32 hundredths and we wanted to round it to the nearest tenths place, again, I would look at my tenths place, and I would look here, and the 2 is not quite halfway, so I would round to 4 and 3 tenths. Always look at the place value that you're wanting to round to, and then look at the number to the right. That number to the right tells you where on the number line you fall. If it's 5 or greater, you're going to round up. If it's below 5, you're going to keep it the same. So at this point, you can continue to practice and do your checkpoints.